Sometimes at the Tenement Museum, people will look around this neighborhood and they'll say, when did Chinatown take over? I always feel a little funny about that question because the Chinese were actually here before almost anybody else. There was a Chinatown in Lower Manhattan even before the Civil War. The problem is that in 1882, the federal government passed the Chinese Exclusion Act. That made it virtually illegal for more Chinese immigrants to come to New York. So while the Jewish Lower East Side was able to grow, Chinatown was not. There were some Chinese migrants who came from out west. They were fleeing persecution where there was violence, even lynchings against Chinese immigrants, but it didn't really grow that big, the Chinatown behind me, until after 1965. That's when the federal government finally repealed a lot of those earlier racist immigration quota laws. Chinese immigrants began arriving here finally in larger and larger numbers. But even then, Chinatown was still pretty small relative to the old Jewish and increasingly Puerto Rican Lower East Side. Two events, much more recent, changed all that. One, in 1979, the communist government of the People's Republic of China decided to experiment with capitalism. And they began introducing capitalism and private enterprise into more and more different regions of the People's Republic of China. As that happened, well, what happened is what always happens when you introduce capitalism to a formerly agricultural society. A lot of people are displaced and they begin migrating. They migrate to big cities and many of them came here. The other big event is this. In 1985, the British government, under Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, signed an agreement with the People's Republic of China, promising to turn Hong Kong back to the Chinese communists in 1997. Suddenly, there were all these, well, capitalists and entrepreneurs and even just, private professionals in Hong Kong who began to worry what was going to happen to their private health when Hong Kong became part of a communist country. More and more of those entrepreneurs began investing abroad, especially in Manhattan real estate, which has always been a pretty safe, reliable form of investment. And they began buying a property in and near Chinatown. That's where they knew they could find tenants who they shared a language and a culture with. As that happened, they began to buy up more and more buildings, and the neighborhood began to spread. You can see what happened all the way up to Allen Street behind me. Chinese language signs all up and down the street show the kind of high extent of that expansion. But on the other side of Allen Street in front of me, what we have are a lot of very expensive boutiques, cafes, and art galleries. As property values continue to increase, it really becomes increasingly unaffordable for newly arriving Chinese immigrants. The Chinatown behind me is still big and significant and culturally significant, but the fastest growing Chinatowns are not in Manhattan anymore. They're in Queens and Brooklyn, closer to LaGuardia and JFK airports, where the land is cheaper. That's where the newest arriving Chinese immigrants are. Those are the neighborhoods that are becoming the new focus for the Chinese community in New York City. So, while today some people may say, well, when did Chinatown take over? The question maybe really should be, when did Soho take over? Because that's what we're beginning to see, an increasingly upscale tinge to a formerly much more working class immigrant enclave neighborhood.